Yes, today we're going to be talking about postmodernism. We're going to be talking about people who go beyond a sort of enlightenment vision of the world. I suppose you can say that really a lot of the thinkers we've been thinking about in the 20th century embody some enlightenment ideals while rejecting others. Postmodernism you could view as an anti-enlightenment project, an attempt to discard all of the truths of the Enlightenment, or at least many of them. I shouldn't say truths, that presupposes something about the values of those. Really, the fundamental theses about truth, about knowledge, and so on, from the Enlightenment, and to overturn those and seek an alternative. So, let's start with the idea of romanticism. When we were talking about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, we identified him as a romantic, as somebody who harkens back in his poetry to romantic poetry and sees himself as, on the one hand, both an emblem of the 1960s and also a representative of a romantic movement. What exactly does that mean? We identified a few themes before, but let me try to summarize them. The romantic emphasizes freedom from restraints, freedom from rules. Nietzsche, in that sense, is already a romantic, saying freedom consists in being able to discard rules and being able to live however you want independently of rules. It involves imagination, a stress on feeling as opposed to reason. The thought is that reason, even if it has a role, does not have the most important role in living, that we are creatures who are far more than just rational creatures. We include an emotional side, an imaginative side. Various aspects of us really can't be captured through pure rationality. So we might, as Aristotle said, be rational animals, but we're also much more than that. Romanticism tends to include revolutionary political ideas. That's something we see emerging in the 1960s. It's something we saw emerging in the 19th century with the Romantic movement. Marx is, in a sense, a romantic. It also involves a kind of primitivism, a love of nature, of individualism, of idealism, a sort of emphasis on nature and our direct relation to nature, as opposed to something that is mediated through civilization. And then finally, it is an anti-enlightenment movement. Poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats were seeing themselves as rebelling against a kind of enlightenment classicism. And the project, you might say, of Romanticism in the 19th century and then in its 20th century revival really involves that kind of rebellion against certain aspects of the Enlightenment. Well, we've talked about a number of intellectual trends from the Enlightenment, and in one sense, the postmodernists start with something that takes off from that. We distinguish the manifest image of the world as we ordinarily perceive it from the scientific image, this hidden level that is introduced to explain things at the manifest level. And in the scientific revolution, that's really a world of microparticles, of things that are beyond our ordinary experience, underlying it and explaining it ultimately. The thought is, in some way, the scientific image takes precedence over the manifest image. It's telling us what the world really consists of, what really explains what's going on. Now, that kind of theory, as we've seen, can be found in many forms. It can be found in Freud, in Marx, in a variety of other thinkers. And it emerges in the 1960s in a new form, in a form known as structuralism. Postmodernism is, in a sense, a form of post-structuralism. So what do I mean by structuralism? Well, here's one way of defining it. It's the belief that the phenomena of human life, that is to say the manifest image, is not intelligible except through their interrelations. So to understand the things of the manifest image, we have to understand how they relate to one another. These relations constitute a structure, and behind local variations in the surface phenomena, there are constant laws of abstract culture. So the idea is, you really have to think not in terms of what the individual things are, but think about their structural relations to one another. This got started in many ways in linguistics and in anthropology with the work of Noam Chomsky and Levi-Strauss and others, but it spread throughout a large part of the humanities and social sciences. So the idea was the elements are less important than the structure, the relations in which those elements stand, and laws ultimately come out of that conception of structure. So to understand society, for example, the structure will say, understand the structural relations among the people in that society. To understand language, understand the structural relations among various words. Well, in some sense, we've already seen a sort of version of this. We've seen the scientific conception of things from the Enlightenment the manifest image, where we think of ourselves as free, we act for reasons, we have responsibility because we act rightly or wrongly, viciously or virtuously. And the scientific image, where there's this depth, this hidden level, where instead we're really determined by what's going on at some other level. And we're not conscious of things at that level, so we can't really give reasons that explain our behavior. What we call our reasons emerge here as merely rationalizations. Morality doesn't make much sense, either that or it's code for something else. And really we have no responsibility on this conception because we have no freedom. And so the postmodernist, in a sense, starts with that. And starts by trying to take that picture and then, sorry, I'm going too fast, but you've seen these slides before. This should be familiar stuff, I'm just reminding you. But the idea, in a way, is that once you have this conception, you start looking at everything in a different sort of way. And in particular, if you think, look, at the bottom level, things are really understood, not in terms of what their essences are, but in terms of their structural relations to one another, then it changes all of this, and it gives you a new sort of perspective. So I've been talking about postmodernism as a kind of post-structuralism. Well, what is postmodernism? Here's one way of understanding it. This is the Simpsons definition. The words of Mo Sislak, the bartender. We in for the sake of win. Okay. Now, we'll do better than that, but that's one way of looking at it. Here is a graph depicting articles that mention postmodernism. You can see how in sort of the popular press it's been soaring. In academic press it sort of reached its high point in the mid to late 90s and has been declining somewhat since then. Anyway, how can we define it more precisely? Here's what one of the practitioners says to try to define it. It's a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices employing concepts such as difference, repetition, the trace, the simulacrum, and hyperreality to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, and the univocity of meaning. Now, if you understand that, you're smarter than I am. But in any event, let's not start with that definition. The postmodernists, if you ask them to explain themselves, often do it in a way that's really unhelpful. So instead, I want to look at somebody whose work really helped to define this from the beginning, and whose work is much clearer than that of most later postmodernists. That person is Lyotard. He wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition, which in some sense starts the whole tradition and defines some of its essential character. Anyway, here's what he says. Any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse of this kind, well, that is to say, that makes explicit appeal to some grand narrative. And now that grand narrative might be something, what he's really talking about is something like a two-level theory, where you've got some narrative that is supposed to explain everything. So in Freud, it might be this story about the unconscious. In Marx, it might be some story about economic determinism, it might be some story about material behavior, whatever it actually is. It might involve the dialectics of spirit, the hermeneutics of meaning, the emancipation of the rational or working subject, the creation of wealth, whatever it is. It might be an economic story, a psychological story, a story about rationality, a story about microparticles. For the moment, don't worry about what's at this depth or this hidden level. The thought is that we're focusing on something that has that kind of grand story to it, that says, I can explain things. I can give you a grand narrative that accounts for all of this. And he says, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. In other words, he's saying, be suspicious of all of that. When somebody says, I have this grand narrative that explains everything, he's saying the postmodernist rejects that whole idea. So from one point of view, the postmodernist rejects this two-level idea, where there is a depth level that explains everything. The thought is there is no grand story to be told about that. There is no grand narrative. There is no final story that explains everything. So as soon as Marx tells you, aha, it's not a question of consciousness determining life, but life determining consciousness, and then I can give you a theory of life, that is to say material behavior, be suspicious. As soon as Freud says, aha, I can explain the manifest phenomena of experience by talking about these subconscious forces, be suspicious. As soon as the scientist says, really, I can explain everything in terms of the motion of microparticles, be suspicious. Don't believe it. Incredulity is just a refusal to believe it. Okay, so here is in part why. He says, there isn't one grand narrative. There isn't one story that explains everything. Actually, There are multiple communities and multiple systems of meaning. There are many different language games. He's taking that phrase from Wittgenstein. A heterogeneity of elements. They only give rise to institutions in patches. There's a local kind of determinism. So here's the basic idea. When you go into a biology class and you're studying biology, science of life, you're being told a sort of narrative that explains a lot of things. And it might explain those things. And there's a kind of community of meaning there. Biologists use certain terms in certain ways. They explain certain kinds of phenomena. So far, so good. But they don't tell you the whole story about the universe. Then you go into an astronomy class, and it talks about certain aspects of the universe. And that's all good. Okay, that explains things, but it doesn't explain everything. You walk into this class, and I start talking about various systems of thought, and I'm doing something that hopefully explains something, but it doesn't explain everything. And the same thing is true of other humanities courses or social science courses, or for that matter, thinking about the world through the lens of art or music, or just staying at the level of the manifest image and sort of practical wisdom and common sense. All of those are stories about the world, and all of them can do some explaining. They have a function, but they have a function within a certain kind of, well, as Wittgenstein would have said, a language game. Within a certain framework where there's some problems you're trying to solve, some things you're trying to explain, you introduce these to explain. If you say, I want you to put it all together, tell me the big story that includes the humanities and the social sciences and common sense and natural science and so on, and art, he's going to say, there is no such story. Stop looking for the grand big story that explains everything. There is no such story. It's all local. It's all geared toward a certain well-defined set of problems. He draws a distinction between scientific knowledge and narrative knowledge. And it goes something like this. Knowledge in general can't be reduced to science, nor even to learning. Learning is the set of statements which, to the exclusion of all other statements, denote or describe objects and may be declared true or false. So in other words, he's saying, look, we've got science, and that tells us some things about the world. It has very strict rules, and meaning is established in pretty well-defined ways within the sciences. Though it varies from science to science, even that isn't really a fully unified story. But then we go to learning. Well, learning is all about the things that can be true or false, that are actually, let's say, put up against the test of experience. They might be true, they might be false. But then there are other things. There is knowledge in general that can go beyond even that. He says what is meant by the term knowledge isn't just a set of statements. Far from it. It includes notion of know-how, knowing how to live, how to listen, and so on. Knowledge is a question of competence that goes beyond the simple determination and application of the criterion of truth. In short, yes, knowing that something is the case, knowing truths, that's part of knowledge, but it isn't everything. A lot of knowledge comes down to knowing how to do something. So, let's think of what is something you know how to do. Program a computer. Okay, good. Let's say you do know how to program a computer. Does that come down to knowing that? Blah, blah, blah. It really doesn't reduce to that, right? Maybe you've got a certain problem. You're trying to make the computer do something. You're trying to write the program. You've got to know how to actually do that. It's not just a question of knowing that this means this, and so on. What are some other things you might know how to do?
Ride a bike.
Ride a bike. Good. Ride a bike. Suppose I say, yeah, I don't know how to ride a bike. Teach me how. Please give me a 20-page paper on how to ride a bike. I'll read it, then I'll know how. It's not like that, right? Knowing how to ride a bike is a very important kind of knowledge, but it certainly can't be reduced to a set of statements that you know to be true. In much more an obvious sense there than in the case of doing a computer program, though in some ways it's similar. Doing a proof in mathematics, writing a program, that's something that requires that you know how to do certain things. It doesn't reduce to just knowing that a bunch of stuff is the case. And it's much more obvious if you think about something that would be actually hard to describe in words, like knowing how to run a bicycle. What are some other things you might know how to do? Yeah?
Knowing how to talk to people.
Knowing how to talk to people, exactly. Some people are very good at communicating with other people. They know how to listen, they know how to speak, they know how to converse. Other people can't do it. In fact, I have a friend who is a fantastic singer. I mean, she's really wonderful. She lights up a concert hall, beautiful soprano voice. She's also a very nice person, easy to work with, easy to do music with, and so on. But after the concert, she's, standing in front of hundreds of people, thousands of people, singing. She has no problem at all. But now saying hello to you after the concert, she's terrified. Okay? It's like singing Mozart or something? No problem. Actually talking to somebody and making small talk? I have no idea how to do that. And so she gets terrified. And it really is the sort of thing that, you can't explain to her by just saying, well, here, read this article and come talk to people. Just have to know that A is true and B is true and C is true. No, it's not like that. It's a kind of knowledge that doesn't involve, or it seems at least to go far beyond knowledge that. There are some contemporary philosophers who think that all these knowing hows reduce to knowing that's. Lyotard would say that's ridiculous. Of course that's not true. It seems to me, by the way, Lyotard's absolutely right on it. It seems to me an insane thesis. But part of how you get famous in philosophy these days is you come up with some insane thesis and then you argue for it cleverly. They teach you how to do this, especially at, certain schools I won't name. In any event, but not here. Here we care about the truth. We don't just teach people to think up idiotic ideas and then defend them cleverly. Well, in any case, so here's a picture. Boy, that's really dark. But the idea is that science really does consist, at least not entirely, but in much larger part, in a question of knowing that this happens, and this happens. Now, not all of science is like that. You have to know how to do an experiment. You have to know how to draw an inference from the data that you're given. You need to know how to actually use the knowledge that you have to solve a certain problem. So science already involves lots of knowing how. But then learning goes far beyond science. There are all sorts of things you know about the world that you're not going to learn in a science classroom. But then there are all sorts of things you know how to do. Knowing a person is like this. You might know your friend very well, but can that be reduced to a bunch of that statements? Is it really just a question of knowing how? Knowing a person actually goes beyond both of those. So this area of knowledge is actually quite varied. There's a lot of knowing that, but lots of knowing how, lots of knowing a person or a thing, lots of knowing too. You know to feed the cat, or you know to reset the clock when it goes away from daylight savings time. That isn't a question of knowing that. It's a question of, a different kind of knowledge. It's much broader than all of that. So in short, this is the sort of picture. The scientific image at best gives us a little part of that science part. Even then, it probably only gives us part of that. But it certainly doesn't touch the larger area of learning or this broader sense of knowledge. And in fact, here I've drawn them as if they're unified, but really a better picture would show that at all three of these levels, we've really got a mixture of things. There isn't just one science that tells us everything about the world, nor is there one kind of learning, nor is there one kind of knowledge in the broader sense. There's knowing how to do this, knowing how to do that, knowing to do this, knowing your friend. All of that is really highly varied. So really, this should be a kaleidoscope effect. Lots of different local bits of knowledge that go on at all of those different levels. But he says these narratives allow us, as the society in which they're told, to define its criteria of competence, and on the other to evaluate, according to those criteria, what is performed or can be performed within it. So when you count somebody as knowing how to ride a bicycle, part of what we do in these games, in these smaller narratives, is we define things like that. Can you really do it very well? I mean, look, I'm the sort of person who thought he could ride a bicycle until some people said, hey, we've got this bicycle club. You want to come and ride with us? And I found out immediately that I couldn't do it. Actually, I found out before even going out on the bicycle ride. My daughter went on a ride, where she couldn't really ride a bicycle. But I knew enough to say, they said, well, we're going to do this at 7 o'clock, and it was in the summer. And I said, won't it still be pretty hot at 7 o'clock? And they said, we mean 7 a.m. And I said, yeah, forget it. So right away I'd be like, I don't, riding a bicycle at 7 a.m., are you kidding me? But anyway, my daughter went, and she thought, I know how to ride a bicycle. But these are the sort of people who think, oh, this weekend, let's ride to Houston and back. They do that kind of stuff. They do 100 miles all the time. And so being able to ride around your neighborhood is a different deal entirely. But anyway, those kinds of criteria are things we establish. How good you have to be in English to count as a speaker of English, to know how to speak English. How good you have to be able to do a mathematical proof, to know how to prove things, or to write a computer program, or all of those things. We set standards for all of this. So it isn't just that there's a body of knowing here. It's also a matter of setting a standards and saying, all right, when are you competent at all of these things? When are you excellent at it? And so on. Now, that is one element of postmodernism, but there's also a strong skeptical element. He says the referent, for example, the path of the planets, of which Copernicus speaks, is supposed to be expressed by a statement in conformity with what actually is. That is to say, if you're thinking about a story, either the old Ptolemaic story or Copernican story or Kepler's story about the motions of the planets and so on, you might think, well, that's true if it matches the way the world really is. But he says, look, we can only know that through other statements. So he says, all of this becomes problematic. What I say is true because I prove that it is, but what proof is there that my proof is true? And so he's worried about this. I might have evidence for something, but how do I know that's good evidence? I might have an argument for something, but how do I know that the premises of my argument are actually true? I might say, look, here's how I established this conclusion because of this evidence, because of these considerations. But how do I know that those are correct? He's worried about a possible infinite regress. He says, well, in science we solve this because we take certain things as just not susceptible to proof. Some things can be proved, and other things are just evidence, and we don't worry about proving them. But he says, look, I'd like to say I can prove something because the reality is that way, but as long as I can produce proof, it's permissible to think reality is the way I say it is. And so in the end, he says, look, as long as I tell a story that makes sense of our experience and is consistent, then it looks like I can say, and I have all the reason I could have for believing that reality is this way. So the postmodernist, in short, turns into a kind of skeptic who says, don't tell me about the way the world really is. All I can really know is what stories, what language games work out in a certain way and end up making sense of my experience, and which ones don't. So postmodern art is hard to characterize, but it has a lot of things that are meant to challenge your conception of reality. Like this, the sneaker that is protruding, it looks like, out of the painting. Or that sort of picture of staircases that suggests a sort of regress. Or that sort of story. It looks like, well, partly a city scene and partly a waffle. Or that, a sign that doesn't quite make sense. Seems to imply you should drive your car into the sea. Or that. I love that one. Negate the negation, and then it's all crossed out. That's so awesome. Or, well, that little kid looking down at the city from this very frightening place. Anyway, here is part of what's going on here. There's an element of this that goes back to the original Romantic philosopher Hegel. Hegel emphasizes that really we can never relate to the world directly. He attacks the idea that he calls the idea of immediacy, that later gets called by Wilfrid Sellars, among others, the myth of the given. He ends up saying there is no direct connection between us and the world. Language and thought don't really relate us to the world directly. Instead, they are almost there as a kind of screen separating us from the world. And so I would like to think I directly relate to things, that, for example, I can directly point at that screen, or that I can point to my own head, or that I can sort of gesture and talk about my hands in a direct sort of way. But Hegel says, well, really not. I say that screen and the concept of screen, or the word screen, stands between me and the reality. I say these hands and the word or concept hand stands between me and what I'm meaning to refer to. So he ends up thinking, yeah, look at that screen, for example. You can think about it, you can point to it, you can touch it even if you're tall enough or can jump high enough. You can use a definite description, the screen, over there, to refer to it. You could even give it a name. You could call it, I don't know, Bob the Screen. Say, look, these things are projected on Bob. And, okay, well, I can do that, but now, am I directly connecting to the world? Hegel thinks it's not a direct link, because I'm identifying it as a screen. I'm pointing to it and saying, that screen. And so there's already that word, that concept, in between me and the thing. If I just point in that general direction, you don't know what I'm pointing at. You'd like to think, and indeed some philosophers like Bertrand Russell thought, look, I am picking out a definite thing directly in the world if I just use a demonstrative like this or that. Suppose I point over there and I say, that! Now Hegel's point is, what am I pointing at? Am I meaning that blackboard, that table, that backpack, that chair? This is rather vague, right? If I just say, I'm talking about that, you can say, I don't know what that is. Actually, my wife does this all the time. I ask her, because I'm terrible at finding things, so I say, where's the such and such? And she'll just say, it's over there. I think, like, where, right? It's in there. Anyway, I'm hopeless. Even when she says, look, on top of the table. I'm like, what table? So it's not clear that in my case, any sufficiently adequate description would point me to the right spot. But in any case, there's always a concept or a word like that. He says, look, you're receiving this complex mix of sensations. I point in this direction, you're looking over here, but there's lots of stuff you're seeing. There are many things. I think you're referring to the blackboard, or to the wood over there, to that railing where the chalk is supposed to sit, to the line between the two parts of the blackboard, to the backpack, to the table, to the surface of the table. There are just many possibilities. And so I need something to help me pin that down. I've got to categorize that multiplicity of sensations somehow, and in order to do that, I have to use a word. I have to use a concept. I have to have some rule for actually combining them in some way. I have to categorize them with something conceptual. And so, he says, look, somehow my mind organizes this swirling mass of sensations that I'm surrounded with all the time into objects. But concepts are the things that do that. And so really, I've got to do what Kant refers to as synthesizing the manifold. The manifold of intuitions means that the manifold of these sensations. I look over here, I'm seeing a whole bunch of things, I'm hearing things as I do it, I'm maybe feeling certain things, and so I've got this complicated mass, and I've got to organize that into something. And so I need something like blackboard, or table, or chair, in order to specify what I'm pointing at, in order to organize all of that into an object that I can then talk about. So that screen, it isn't just given to us, it isn't just data, it's really the product of conceptual activity. That is to say, I say, aha, I'm pointing at the screen, and I need that concept, that categorization of it as a screen to be able to refer. So the idea in general is that thought, or language, or concepts are something like a screen separating us from the world. And we can never get through and really connect to the world directly. We're always looking at the world as if through this sort of window, where our concepts, our own conceptual framework is really standing between us and the world. And so we're always trapped on the other side of something like this. We never have that direct link to the world. Oh, I like that picture. Okay, well, yes. Now, you might think there's an exception. What about me? Surely I'm given directly to myself. After all, Descartes, in the Enlightenment period, started modern philosophy by using the method of doubt, by considering skepticism, and responding this way. There is one thing I can't possibly be skeptical about. Is it possible, from my point of view, that none of you exist, that everything right now that I'm experiencing is really a dream or a hallucination or something? Sure, it's possible. But what about myself? If I'm thinking that I'm giving a lecture, then I must actually exist. I must be thinking. If I think, that very thought makes itself true. And so I think, I exist. Those are things that are true every time they're thought or uttered. I have to be sure of those things. He's looking for something certain, something he cannot doubt, on which he can base knowledge, and that's where he finds it, in the I think, I am. So really, what it comes down to is something like this. Look, I'm a thinking thing. I can be sure that I exist, and that I think. Anytime I think, I exist. That's right. The very fact that I'm thinking, it shows that I do exist. Every time I think, that's got to be right, because I am thinking that very thought. And so, I conclude, he says, that I'm a thing that thinks, in fact, a thing that essentially thinks. So you could say, as he does, maybe I know my own mind better than I know anything else. Yes, between me and the outside world might be a set of concepts, might be language, might be a set of language games, something or other conceptual, but on the other hand, between me and myself, no, surely I know myself directly. I must be given to myself in a way that's more intimate than the way in which anything else could be given to me. So anyway, I think Descartes would say, look, concepts don't come between me and myself. Maybe in looking at the outside world, I'm sort of always looking through this screen of concepts. But when I look at it myself, when I introspect, surely there, I am directly present to myself. I'm right there, so I can know myself directly, surely. But the postmodernists deny it. They say it's not just that there's a screen between me and the outside world, there's a screen between me and myself. I am not given to myself directly either. So he says a self doesn't amount to much, but no self is an island. Each exists in a fabric of relations that's now more complex and mobile than ever before. Young or old, man or woman, rich or poor, a person is always located at nodal points of specific communication circuits, however tiny they might be. In other words, he's using this structuralist idea. What is it to know yourself? It's to know how you relate to other things. And so, what does it mean to know me, to be directly given to me? If you say, who are you, Monback? What can I say? I can use a name like I am Dan Monback, or I can say I'm a professor, I'm an old man, getting older by the moment. Though this has been actually sort of screened off from me. As I get older, I keep feeling like a young man in my department. And it's because we keep hiring faculty who are way older than I am. So I'm still kind of around the middle of the pack, even though I keep getting older. Because we keep hiring all these people in their 70s. I think this is a great idea. Just keep doing that so I can keep feeling like one of the young people.
Oh, no.
That's right, yeah, screw you, you're not as good at PhDs. But no, really, there's sort of a weird thing. You know, you have a conception of yourself, and that's defined by your relations to other people. So do you feel young or old? Well, it depends on who you're hanging around with. You, even at your age, might feel old. If, let's say, you've got a bunch of younger siblings and you're often hanging around your friends, you might be the old one in the group, right? And that affects the way you feel. Or maybe you're actually the youngest child and you're often hanging around with people who are older than you are. Well then, gosh, you might feel especially young. And that can continue for decades, as I've found, if you hang around with the right sort of people. So, in any event, this is something that actually has something to do with the way you view yourself. Well now, this is something the postmodernists are fond of calling decentering. There is no special relation that you have to yourself. You are not given to yourself in the way that Descartes thinks, in this direct fashion. So it's a mistake to think that you really are immediately present even to yourself. It's a mistake to think that you are the center of your world and you are a thinking thing that is fully transparent to yourself. You aren't transparent to yourself. And so, yeah, I like this picture. Not only is there the screen there, but the person is not in the center of the picture. You're really defined by your relations to all these other things. You aren't directly given even to yourself. Now, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the guy who thought up this idea of language games, at one point said the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well, from a postmodern point of view, that's sort of right. But I'm not at the center of that world. And so, yes, my concepts, my language define what the world is for me. But I'm not in the middle of it. I'm not in some special position. I'm just part of that complex world. I'm not in any unique place within it. And so I might be there, but I'm not at the center. I don't have a direct knowledge of anything, even of myself. So my knowledge of myself is already mediated by language, by concepts, by some kind of conceptual framework, by my language, by my society maybe, that gives me all of this. There is something between me and even myself. Well, I'm going to now skip past some things, sadly. Although, I hate skipping past that. But I really want to get to Klein. And so let me leap to rabbits. Oh, yes. Well, I do have to talk about this. Now, you might think, really, in the end, the postmodernist says, look, in a certain sense, this means that everything, even I myself, and some sort of social construct. I get my concepts, my language, from the rest of society. So in some ways, the screen that separates me from reality and even from myself is socially constructed. And so often, the postmodernists conclude, so everything is really a social construct. But there's something that's very odd about that. Our concept of a tornado might be a social construct, but tornadoes aren't social constructs. Tornadoes could exist even if nobody thought about them. The same thing is true of cats. The concept of a cat might be a social construct, but a cat isn't a social construct. Or here's a scientific example. Our concept of a neutron is something that is a social construct. It was thought up by Sir James Chadwick in 1933. But neutrons aren't social constructs. There were neutrons long before there was James Chadwick to give them a name. And so there's a difference between the thing being a social construct and the concept. And often postmodernists talk about the thing as if it were itself constructed. But surely that seems wrong. Ah, yes, well, anyway. Yes, I gotta do this too, okay? My hobby. Sitting down with grad students and timing how long it takes them to figure out that I'm not actually an expert in their field. Engineering takes 48 seconds. Well, our big problem is heat dissipation. Have you tried logarithms? Yeah, that's stupid. Linguistics. Ah, so does this Finno-Ugric family include, say, Klingon? All right, 63 seconds. Sociology. Oh yeah, my latest work is on ranking people from best to worst. That takes about 4 minutes. But then literary criticism, in other words, postmodernism. You see, the deconstruction is inextricable from not only the text, but also the self. 8 papers and 2 books, and they still haven't caught on. So anyway, the danger of this sort of thinking is that you free yourself so much from the world, there aren't any constraints at all. And in the end, really, where there is no truth, where there are no constraints, there's only power.